B, then applying the left constant to the object I get by introduction on proofs of A and B in that way, so that this C is obtained by the introduction rule. That would be nothing but the proof A of A, which we are given. And simultaneously, if I write the right-hand side there, I would write B in B there. So this is nothing but a linearization of the Pravit's reduction rule for conjunction, as beautifully exposed and set out, very nice exposition indeed, in the Elements of Intuitions. 10 years old. Well, now, then, we would have here, this notion of definitional identity is just that, definitional. It's not propositional in nature. In fact, it comes before any propositional function over the type in question. The propositional function will be defined as a function having a certain set as its range of significance, and this notion of identity precedes the set itself. It can therefore not be a propositional function over that set. And the propositional function of the set is just defined by the introduction and elimination rules, the notion of propositional identity. And this tallies very well indeed with things that Professor Dummet says about sense and reference on an intuitionistic point of view from the logical basis of metaphysics. Namely that the definitional equality is the strict identity, it's non-propositional and so on, where this is Sinnesgleichheit, whereas Bedeutungsgleichheit is nothing but the propositional function defined by the, like any other logical constant, defined by its introduction. That is the identity axiom for identity. And so what the ancient Babylonians discovered was that in the category of heavenly bodies, Hesperus was propositionally equal, was identical in the Bedeutungsgleichheit sense, but they are definitely not definitionally equal as heavenly bodies. So, well, this then would be my second vestige of Convegno, because in Elements of Intuitionism, Professor Dummet treats, like Frege, strict identity as if it were a propositional function. And I think that it is not. So this is a quasi-vestige. But when we do the same thing for state of affairs, the matter becomes serious. Because equal formulations can be found in paragraph 5 of What is the Theory of Meaning 2, the falsificationist paragraph concerning state of affairs. It must be decidable on state of affairs, whether on a structural standpoint it is so incredibly tied up with a realist ontology. And it's very hard to see what its identity and application criteria would be on a constructive position. Mentioning that briefly at least, that Professor Dummet was the first author, I think, in the intuitionist tradition who actually said that truth is equal to provability. He said this in 1974 in the preprint version of the first part of Elements of Intuitionism. So subsequently, Putnam said that truth is independent of knowledge here and now, but not of all justification in toto and so on. But I think that this is the source of it in the modern discussion. And Professor Pravitz has said similar things, Martin Loebs now said similar things. So that the proposition is true if there exists a proof object of it. I want to stress a proof object, because proof, like construction, is ambiguous between, on the other hand, the act of proof and the object resulting from the act, or judgment in the Kantian sense. Thus, absurdity is true. It's a logically possible judgment in this sense. It means nothing more than that it has been laid down what a proof object would be, namely, there is no such thing in this case. Then we would have a real possible proof object. That is the case when the proof object can be found, but well, it also perhaps is found, but when it is really possible to find one. Real möglich comes there, and then a wirklich object. Well, concerning these notions, Professor Dummet said in the Elements of Intuitionism, these are claims. These are not propositions, and it is most natural to treat them as claims. That is, that one would only have the right to make such a claim if one had actually found the thing. So we can only know that something is potentially true by knowing it is actually true. And similarly for falsity, we can only know that something is false by reducing the idea that no proof of it can be found, by showing that no proof of it can be found. not the other way around. And therefore, there is nothing at all difficult in this notion for the constructivist. He just stayed with it. Well, he has cracked back from this position in his reply to Dan Pravitz in the Barry Taylor volume, and now says that, well, if we construe existence as something tenseless, this we must, on the constructivist position, then we are driven towards realism, because if there is, either one can be found or it can't be found. Well, I think that this is something which is natural only if you adhere to this fifth vestige of realism. Only if you already believe in realism is this natural to say. Otherwise, there is no reason at all. And this, I think, illustrates a bit of the illusory character of arguments in philosophy. Namely that you only believe what you want to believe. I have talked about Professor Dummet's famous argument in terms of manifestations on with many practicing and committed realists. None has ever been convinced. And, but what has happened is what we also see in the literature. Positions are refined, sharpened, explored, new positions are explored, and so on. This is, in fact, something which was predicted in 1797 in the brilliant exposition of the realist-anti-realist debate by Fichte in the Einleitung to the Wissenschaftslehre from 1797, where he contrasts, on the one hand, the idealist position, his version of Kantianism, with the position he calls dogmatism, that's realism. Right, and it says that neither will convince the other. There are these two coherent, consistent positions, and they are too different to convince the one the other. They will remain convinced of their points, but the positions will become more and more refined, and I think this is what happens. So I think my time is up, so I will just conclude by saying then that although my examination has been critical, I hope that it should be clear that if I may borrow a page from Truth and Other Enigmas, that I would not have spent so much time trying to trace and follow these things if I had not had the greatest esteem and admiration for the works. In fact, if I may continue the analogy from Isaiah Berlin, I think I would like to say that Michael is a fox, explores many avenues, and the fox who knows he is a fox, according to the preface of Truth and Other Enigmas, and what a joy it is to follow him on his explorations. Thank you very much. Well, I mean, proof there are two things then. On the other hand, the mental act of the individual mathematician. And I think, let's do it in this way. When we have laid down the meaning of a certain proposition, what a proof object is then perfectly fixed. There is no debate possible. That is what it is to be meaningful for a proposition, that this question has been laid out. But whether one can be found or not is something which is open. And if it is possible to find one, if a proof object has got potential existence, this is nothing. If a proof object is findable, then we would say this. So it is the possibility of finding a certain mathematical object. And it is sort of, it is not in the notion of possibility in the sense of contingency related to possible worlds. This is rather the notion of potentiality as opposed to actuality, which is involved here. The good example would be perhaps, let us consider the number of stones used to build the beautiful castle in Mussomeli. Say, I think, on general grounds, then m is the number of stones so used. This is a proposition. And for a certain number, I would say less than 10 to the 10 to the 10. Very simply on grounds of physics. For a certain number, I don't know which, but for a certain number less than 10 to the 10 to the 10, it is a real possibility that that number is the number of stones used. And we can find out what number it is by means of counting. And then the possibility has become actualized. And so there you would have an example of a proposition. I can't say which one it is, because as I said, you can't point and say that this is a potentially but not yet actually true proposition. I can only say that one of these propositions is potentially true, but I don't know which one. But for a certain number, less than 10 to the 10 to the 10, then I'm on the safe side. One of these propositions is a potentially true proposition, because a proof object exists potentially.
Which of these real possibilities, we find one of them to be we make one actual, then it is then we discover something, and it is in virtue of these actual, real possibilities that we now.
Real possibilities. No, you couldn't say that.
No. We make something actual, and when we do that by proving something, we do that, or it is now true. When we discover the truth, and there is some, it's not a choice that we make, because there is just one of these logical possibilities that are the real possibilities.
Also the possibility to find, yes. But the
so
only...
there is some objectivity. What
there
I
is
want to say
certainly,
that
there is certainly considerable objectivity, yes, but the only principle through which we can come to know something about them is ab esse, ab posse. From the is to the possible. From the being to the possible being. I mean, that's the order of priority between actuality and potentiality from Aristotle onwards. And so, in that sense, one could not, I mean, what Professor Dummet did in this reply to you is that he gives up that principle. He renounces that principle of esse, ab posse, as the only way of coming to know something, which he upholds staunchly in Elements of Intuition. So, I would agree with this, that the possibility to find, yes, can be found. If we adopt this to tense and so on, if you consider, people often ask about Lindemann's proof of pi, transcendence. Was it true that pi was transcendent even before this? Well, with respect to potential truth, the question is senseless, because that notion is tenseless. So there, the question falls away. And with respect to actual truth, truth as known, of course, the answer is a loud and clear no.
Sorry, can you repeat this?
Yes.
So it's not
With
the question
respect-
asking Lindemann's proof that pi is transcendent.
No, not about the proof, but about pi's transcendence. Was it true that pi is transcendent even prior to Lindemann's proof in 1882 or so? And as far as the notion of potential truth is concerned, the answer is, the question is senseless, because that notion is tenseless. It doesn't make sense to ask prior or later with respect to a tenseless notion. And with respect to the notion of actual truth, truth as having come to be known, then the answer is, it was not known prior to Lindemann's coming to know it in 1882.
I think a lot of clarification is needed, especially for those with strong vestiges of realism within their minds. In 1870, pi is transcendental. It would be correct to say pi is transcendental is a possible truth. Right?
It would only, to make that claim, would only have been correct if you knew that this was the case. And this you didn't know. These are claims, not statements, not propositions. I mean, I should say also that I have refrained from using Mr. Dummet's favorite term, statement, because I taught a course on Sybil Wolfram's logic, in which statements are used in philosophical logic, and it is there ambiguous in 5 different ways. So between the proposition, between the assertion, between the act of asserting or the act of judging, between the state of affairs, and also between the content of assertion, something like that. And so I think statement is a very dangerous notion, which I prefer not to
Not
use.
as bad as proposition.
No, I certainly think so. I think as far as I understood your use of it, you use it to incorporate phenomena of index to calculus.
I think I don't use it consistently.
I found that, yes.
But I wonder whether I can insist with pi. Could pi have not been transcendental before that time? Of course it couldn't. Otherwise we would get a contradiction when, from the from the time Glindemann gave the
Well, I
I mean,
no, I
if
would
you-
say again, the question is senseless because you introduce tense where tense doesn't belong.
Well, in the formulation I tried
I
to
could-
use, I didn't apply tense to is a possible truth, but to correct to say. You say things at particular times, and what you say may be correct or incorrect. It may be a justified or an unjustified claim, but there's no question but that you can modify.
That you would try to incorporate the proof object analysis also to large parts of natural language. I would be uncertain whether, for instance, it is correctly statable that, if that is a proposition. That is, taking a proposition, apply this operation to, the result is yet again a proposition. If that is the correct logical form, if that's the right way to analyze it. The same way I think I mentioned, it was right now in the break after the last paper, mentioned this possibility again, that modality, it seems to me, on this approach, is a notion which I would rather say would adhere to claims rather than to propositions or statements. That is, that the box and the diamond would be part as propositional correctness. It seems very hard, indeed, to give assertion conditions for modalities, whereas to try to say things about the necessity of a certain justification of a claim seems more of a causal direction. This is, of course, also a very Kantian move. It tends in that direction too.
Yeah.
But then, of course, the modal logic would go aboard. The modal logic in the sense of S4 and S5 and whatnot would not be applicable to these constructions.
Just very quick remark. So it seems to me that one would like, of course, to have this possibility of a mixed language. So I mean, it's something we want to connect the mathematical activities with other things. So,
Though if one would want to incorporate in that something so highly self-reflective and philosophically as it is correctly stated, that is a matter of debate. But certainly I think I would like to incorporate, of course, questions about green grass and snow which is white and so on. And that seems to me to be a major task.
I don't know if it's correctable, stateable that. So this, of course, is something very interesting.
It is certainly
to
very interesting, but the question is whether one would expect that to be a notion to have the same type of logical form and the same type of meaning explanations. As for instance, questions as to sums of natural numbers or greenness of grass. And my connection would be not.
But it's a sentence which makes, it's a saying which makes sense, of course.
Yes.
It must make sense.
There was perhaps one thing which might clarify something, but not too much, but things which was said earlier today and which you have said in your books as well, that a proof of A or B is a proof of A or a proof of B. You said this morning. And
That's the
I would,
conventional.
yes, I think one should not say this because that would make either A or the proof
Yes.
small little a or capital A or the proof little b or capital B, the proof of two propositions. The proof wouldn't determine its conclusion.
Right.
And that's unfortunate. Right. And you argue, in fact, against, I would include a 0 and a 1 or something
Yes,
like that
yes,
to disambiguate. And
you're right.
In Elements of Intuition, you say that this is a foolish suggestion. I think it is not.
No, okay, I take that point and I accept it. It doesn't actually alter the force of what I was saying in the earlier discussion.
What would happen with potential truth, that was why I raised the example,
Yes.
is that as far as actual truth is concerned, it is not true to say the claim that A or B is true is when that is actually made rightly. Neither of the two claims, A is true or the other claim, B is true, need actually to be claimed at that moment.
Well, certainly.
For actual truth, it doesn't work, but for potential truth, it does work. Because when a proof object of A or B can be found, such a proof object allows us to find the proof object either for A or for B. And so the possibility of finding a proof object for A or a proof object for B is then granted. So then, and that is the sense in which this is correct on this.
Right.
And the same, mutatis mutandis, the same point would hold for all the other T sentences. But note that the connectives on the right-hand side would be claim connectives and not statement connectives. And so they would not themselves be subject to explanations according to proof objects.
Right.
Some other comments? This is a good time to close the conference. And so to thank everybody.
The session.
Close the first session. We will gather here again for the second session tomorrow. And I thank every participant in the discussion. Speakers.
Right, so that's not a fiction, right?
All right. I'll read you up.
communication. If the latter, the danger is that the norm has no clear relation to practice. Michael Dummet thinks that by promoting the primacy of the idiolect, I run afoul of Wittgenstein's ban on private languages. In my view, Dummet, by making language primary, has misplaced the essential social element in linguistic behavior. In this paper, I want to try to sort out and clarify the issues involved. There is no such thing as a language, I wrote in a piece called A Nice Derangement of Epitaphs. Now, this is the sort of remark for which one can expect to be pilloried, and Michael did not spare me. I must think, he teases, that when Bretons, Catalans, Basques, and Kurds declare that language is the soul of their culture, or dictators attempt to suppress minority languages, that Bretons, Catalans, Basques, Kurds, and dictators are all suffering from the illusion that there are such things as languages to cherish or suppress. In this paper, I may allow my rhetoric to carry me away a bit, because at the time I wrote it, I was under the influence of the style of Michael's reply. Well, in fact, I did offer an alternative account of a language. I'll say more about that later. But first, let's look at the concept of a language that I was opposed to. It was this. In learning a language, a person acquires the ability to operate in accord with a precise and specifiable set of syntactic and semantic rules. Verbal communication depends on speaker and hearer sharing such an ability, and it requires no more than this. I argued that sharing such a previously mastered ability was neither necessary nor sufficient for successful linguistic communication. I held in that paper, and hold now, that the linguistic skills people typically bring to conversational occasions can and do differ considerably, but mutual understanding is achieved through the exercise of imagination, appeal to general knowledge of the world, and awareness of human interests and attitudes. Differentiated in practice, nor, therefore, what we normally mean by the word language. The second is that neither the usual concept nor the philosophical concept is very important in understanding what is essential to verbal communication. The ultimate persuasiveness, if not the correctness, of this second claim depends on presenting an alternative account of what is essential to verbal communication, things in which we understand others without conscious effort or reflection. And he hints that this reveals an underlying error or confusion on my part. Now, I don't think I've ever conflated the empirical question, how we actually go about understanding a speaker, with the philosophical question, what is necessary and sufficient for such understanding. I have focused on the latter question, not because I think it brings us close to the psychology of language learning and use, but because I think it brings out the philosophically important aspects of communication, while the former tempts us to speculate about arcane empirical matters that neither philosophers nor psychologists know very much about. So let me say, not for the first time, I don't think we normally understand what others say by consciously reflecting on the question what they mean, by appealing to some theory of interpretation, or by summoning up what we take to be the relevant evidence. We do it much of the time effortlessly, even automatically. We can do this because we've learned to talk pretty much as others do, and this explains why we generally understand without effort much that they say. It's significant, though, that Michael tries to saddle me with the extremely restricted meaning given the word interpretation by the translators of Wittgenstein. According to this meaning, an interpretation of a word or expression is always another word or expression. This is quite definitely, and I should have thought clearly, not the meaning that I had in mind, though I guess confusion is pretty easy here. If I ask how somebody interpreted an utterance of the sentence, "snow is white," and am told that she interpreted it as meaning that snow is white, or as being true if and only if snow is white, we shall go astray if we make a literal equation of the mastery of a practice with the possession of theoretical knowledge of what the practice is. Now, you'll notice that I don't speak of implicit knowledge here or anywhere else. The point is not that speaker or hearer has a theory, but that they speak and understand in accord with a theory that's needed only when we want to describe their abilities and even perhaps performance. On a further important issue, Michael and I again see eye to eye. We both insist that verbal behavior is necessarily social. In my view, and I think in his, this is not just a matter of how we use the word language. There couldn't be anything like a language without more than one person. Perhaps we even agree on the underlying reason, namely something like Wittgenstein's, that without a social environment, nothing could count as misapplied. But I don't think it shows, as Button insists, that meanings ain't in the head. For we can take it to be part of the meaning of an expression that its reference is to be determined by expert opinion, or mastered. Now, of course, even if there were no such thing to be learned, it wouldn't follow that we could understand speech without knowing anything. We'd have to know much more. And it is, in fact, a major contention of my paper that we do know and use much more, even in grasping just the literal meanings of a speaker's words, than our mastery of any fixed set of rules would allow us to grasp. But this is not the central misunderstanding. It springs once more from the fact that Dummet does not want to notice that what I said was there was no such thing as what some philosophers have described as a language to be learned. The phenomena is, the data is, the octopi are. These are often part of the practice of one speaker, but not of another. But communication doesn't suffer, though affection and admiration may wither. We have no trouble following the conversation of the child who says, he wented to the store, and indeed who generally forms the past tense according to a rule which is not part of, quotes, the language. Actual cases grow rarer as they grow more extreme, but more extreme cases certainly exist. People who speak dialects of what we call the same language may not at first be able to make anything of what the other says. After they learn to understand each other, each may continue to speak in his own way, just as I have learned to answer letters that come to me in German, Spanish, French, but my answers go back in English. Someone with a unique and serious speech defect may learn to make himself understood to those around him, but they don't speak the way he does. And he quotes Wittgenstein, if you have to have an intuition in order to develop the series 1, 2, 3, 4, then you must also have one to develop the series 2, 2, 2. I can think of 3 strategies for dealing with my doubts. One can claim that I've ignored the fact that speakers of a language are responsible to a social norm, even if they don't hold to it. One can concede that communication without shared practices may be theoretically possible, but argue that this is pointless speculation, given that it never occurs in a pure form and probably couldn't. And finally, it may be urged that no alternative answer to Wittgenstein's query has been offered, the query being, what is the difference between using words correctly and merely thinking that one is using them correctly? So I'll take up these 3 responses in turn. According to Michael, and this is a quote, figures of speech and other deliberately non-standard uses apart, a speaker holds himself responsible to the accepted meanings of words and expressions in the language or dialect he purports to be speaking. His willingness to withdraw or correct what he said when made aware of a mistake about the meaning of the word in the common language therefore distinguishes erroneous uses from intentionally deviant ones. That's the end of the quote. Now, of course, it's easy to agree that people speak as they think others do, except when they don't. And if dialects can be divided as finely as need be, I can have no objection to much of the spirit of Michael's claim. The blacks in Brooklyn don't want to speak as whites do, and some individuals, James Joyce, though they want to be understood, don't want to talk as anyone else does. But the crux is the idea of obligation to the norm constituted by the accepted meanings of words. Not Dummet's view, it's totally obscure what argument he thinks he has with me. I'd better leave Wittgenstein out of this. I'll just say Wittgenstein. It also seems to me important to emphasize that much successful communing goes on that doesn't depend on previously learned common practices. For recognizing this helps us appreciate the extent to which understanding, even the literal meaning of a speaker's utterances, depends on shared general information and familiarity with non-linguistic institutions. Appeal to the test of common usage. This is the hardest and most important challenge, and I agree with Michael if he believes that the challenge can be met only by appeal to a social setting. What is needed is a norm, something that provides a speaker with a way of telling, not necessarily always, that he's gone wrong. A norm, the failure to satisfy which he or she will count as having gone wrong. There's a further condition on a satisfactory description of the norm that I'll come to later. Speaking in accord with socially accepted usage is such a norm, but one which I've argued is irrelevant to communication unless the audience of the speaker happens to speak as he does. An elitist norm, by implying that people not in the right social swim don't really know what they mean. What should we say of the many cases in which a speaker expects or hopes to be understood in a certain way, but isn't? His beliefs about his audience, in particular, how he believes or assumes they will understand him. Now, it may be that once again, Michael and I are just using words in somewhat different ways. In this case, the word intention and belief. I think someone acts intentionally when there's an answer to the question what his reasons in acting were, which is basic to the understanding of verbal communication. Michael thinks at least the former, and probably the latter, is basic. In the papers on which I've been concentrating, Michael avails himself of a notion of meaning that he does not explain, while I avail myself of a concept of understanding that I don't explain. Neither here nor elsewhere, so far as I know, has Michael given an argument to show that a shared way of speaking, a practice or a convention, is essential to meaning something by what one says. We know what it is to go on as before. As a corollary, neither have I given any reason to think meaning is an essentially social phenomenon. Well, here I'll try briefly to summarize how I've tried to answer these questions. Agreeing with Dummet and Kripke, and perhaps with Wittgenstein, I hold that the answer to the question, what it is to go on as before, demands reference to social interaction, really similar. Well, I count them as relevantly similar. I find the stimulus in each case the same, and the response the same. You must also, in some primitive sense, find my pointings similar. The evidence for this is your similar responses. Be taken to show that you took the stimulus to be different, or that for you, this is a similar or not a similar response. As Wittgenstein says, by yourself you can't tell the difference between the situations seeming the same and being the same. Wittgenstein, many commentators hold, thought this point applies only when the stimulus is private. I think it holds for all cases. If you and I can correlate the other's responses with the occurrence of a shared stimulus,
Okay, supposing somebody doubted the thesis that the difference between thinking you're doing the same again and doing it had to have a social basis, and developed the kind of example which I think is fairly familiar in interpretations of Wittgenstein, the kind of example where somebody alone from birth, a genius maybe,
record accurately some repeated phenomenon, which of course would have other connections and would be important for him, and when the usual consequences fail to accrue, begins to think that perhaps he has not done the same thing again, and then corrects himself as he thinks, I mean, in inverted commas, he thinks he corrects himself and then finds that he gets a successful result. You clearly wouldn't accept that, and why?
Yeah, I guess and also the apparent admission that this can happen in Wittgenstein places. You, of course, realize that much of what you describe is taking for granted exactly what I deny. That is, you say this genius records something, but now we've already...
Oh, well, of course, I should say in inverted commas, because it's only at the end of the story if my conclusion is accepted as a possibility that these words apply.
Sure, sure. So now, if I do question this, and the brief reason is that I don't see, if we strike out all those words like believe, expect, and so forth, which are propositional attitudes, if we strike out all those and just describe what goes on in a neutral way, then I would say I don't see anything there which justifies us in saying this creature has the concept of being right or being wrong, that he has the concept of the way the world is versus how he thinks it is. I don't see how those ideas get any grip as long as you've just got one person. He just does react however he does to things, including the marks that he has made on the stone and so forth. Reacts to that. But what's going on in his mind? I don't see any reason to say anything more is going on in his mind than in the mind of an oyster, which turns to face the current so that food comes in.
Well, that might be just because I've told a brief story, and I'm not going to tell a long one, but it would be easy to give a non-question begging, and of course I wasn't begging the question by using words to record them, but it would be easy to describe behavior which would be both as complex as the behavior of a person who did have propositional attitudes and accepted correction from another human being, as complex as that, which would of course raise a problem. How do we explain it? And at this point, I thought that you must have an argument that any explanation which introduced the idea of the right and wrong, anything normative, would be going beyond the evidence in a way in which an explanation which, I don't know, appealed to evolution and something, and wouldn't be going beyond the evidence. And that was the point. Which
yes, I think that's the right point, and I take it. The negative thing is that you have not introduced anything that allows us to say, and justifies us in saying, this creature has got the concept of truth, objective truth, as something being a certain way, even though we, for the moment, didn't think so. And then I'm prepared to say how I think that does. You do have a justification for saying that when two or more people are reacting to the same environment and to each other at the same time, that supplies a necessary ingredient. I don't say that that's all there is to meaning by any means. I just say that as far as I can see, that is the only way in which you can find something that justifies attributing.
Yes. Well, I think if you're ready to argue this out,
yes,
it would be necessary for me to proceed by a kind of auction, making it, in my view, more and more difficult for you
not to accept that explanation, and then you would say in each case why the explanation didn't apply. And of course that would be too long a thing to do now, but that's the strategic situation.
Yes, I do have a what is in part, at least maybe mostly, sort of metaphor, the same image, but nevertheless it contains what I think is an essential part of perhaps the argument that you'd like to hear, though reject in the end. And it goes something like this. As I look at the world, I get these stimulations, and I react in simpler or complex ways, and you can make those ways as complex as you want. But there's a sense in which there's no checking up. Of course, if I have propositional attitudes, I can remember what I thought before and discover that it's wrong, but that would assume the conclusion without establishing it. If, on the other hand, I am reacting to something in the world and to somebody else's reactions to the same things in the world, then there's a kind of triangulation that takes place, and that locates the stimulus and gives a meaning to the idea that there is one that's in a certain distance away. Otherwise, there's no even saying where the stimulus is. I mean, whether it's right at the skin or way out in the heavens. Nothing encourages the idea that there's an objective location. It's just stuff coming in and reactions going out, if you want. But nothing reacting to those things that would justify the claim of a sense of objectivity or of a standard of objectivity. So my argument, I mean, you're right, I wasn't saying very much in favor of that view because I was assuming that pretty much, except at the last page or so, it's hasty, that it's right to suppose that the social environment supplies an essential ingredient. And I was just arguing that it doesn't have to supply it by way of people aping one another.
I absolutely agree that that's the exact description of the difference between you and people like McGinn and myself. And the onus really, I don't know where the onus lies, but at least out there on people like us to provide a way of getting an intersection on the difference between thinking one side and being right, when there are no people around. And unless that's done convincingly, maybe the case goes by default your way.
10 or 15 years, nobody really understood what Frege was trying to communicate in these things. And will you then refrain from applying right or wrong to what he was doing or not?
What you need is the concept of objectivity.
No, I understand. So it would mean that because he could speak German, he would get his notion of objectivity from his interaction in German with other people.
I'm resisting the temptation to say something about the assertion stroke.
Right.
Yes, I'd like to say something. Signal a real disagreement, but that may turn out to be illusory.
That'd be terrible.
Well, no, I don't mean that there's no real disagreement. I mean just in the wrong place. It would be terrible, yes, if we did actually completely agree. I didn't have a copy, so I just wrote down a sentence which I hope I've written down correctly, or nearly correctly. It's something like this. If we can make ourselves understood, no further obligations, not that John denies that there are any further obligations, but no further obligation has anything to do with meaning. And then he went on to say, quoting Aristotle about wine, that it would be absurd to suppose one had an obligation to a language. Now, language is very interesting in the following respect, that, I mean, there are other things which are a bit like this, but language is a prime example of something where I should say there are indeed rules, but the persistence of the rules depends upon their being observed. Donald referred to Humpty Dumpty. You remember, or those of you who've read Alice will remember, that when Humpty Dumpty said, "But by glory, I mean a nice knockdown argument," Alice replied, "But glory doesn't mean that." Now, there are a lot of people, I mean, most influential, no, that's probably not true, but some influential linguists who are constantly praising dictionaries or for being purely descriptive, not prescriptive. Though, you've just got to describe what words people use and with what meanings they use them, as if the meaning with which they use them was a raw data. And you just hear the word and you take in the meaning in essentially the same way. Only such a crude conception could possibly justify the kind of distinction between descriptive and prescriptive, and the kind of praise they give to the descriptive lexicographer, and the sneers they make at the prescriptive lexicographer, only that such a crude conception, of which I'm not, of course, accusing Donald, could justify that attitude. Of course, it's true, as Donald insisted, that we frequently understand people when they speak, as we should say, wrongly, when they speak ungrammatically or use the wrong word. And of course, we often do that very swiftly. Just take a particular example. There's been, I mean, the English language is changing extremely rapidly. And it's changing rapidly largely because people think they have no obligation to the language. They think they have indeed been taught that all that matters is you're getting across your meaning. If you do that, well, that's all it's for, isn't it? So how can there be any right or wrong about how you speak, providing that you get across what you mean? And of course, because of the phenomenon that I talked about, that these are rules whose existence is destroyed by disobedience to them. That itself is a mechanism of linguistic change which is now operative very, very powerfully. Now, one well-known example of this is the use of the word disinterested to mean uninterested. Perfectly good example. There are many, many examples. Of course, suppose you hear someone do this for the first time, you easily guess at what he means, maybe without making much effort. Why? Because if you took him as meaning what the words literally mean, Donald at an early stage in his paper used the phrase literal meaning, but I'm not quite clear why he has a right to it. If you take him as meaning what his words literally mean, what he said is so absurd that you can dismiss the hypothesis that that's what he meant. And you know all sorts of things about the language. You know that dis, like is a negative prefix, and you naturally guess. You can preserve it exactly as it was before, but preserve it in at least as good a condition as it was before. And the obligation, if you like, is not to the language, but to future generations. But that's not exactly the philosophical point. The philosophical point is that it is the case that words have a meaning in a language, and that what makes it the case is precisely the general observance or common observance of the rule, and the fact that people have the conception of their speaking a particular language, and the conception that even if they do flout its rules, they ought to aim at conforming to them. I think without any of these things, it wouldn't make sense to talk about the meaning of the word. Alice's reply would be, as the various reviewers of dictionaries and so on would say, Alice's reply would be a kind of superstition. The reified meaning, that people use that sort of language. Distinct from what some one speaker means on one occasion, or the idiom. Of course, it isn't always just this, but it's very often a matter of what someone wrongly takes the meaning in the language to be. So that you can't explain what it is for him to have that idiom, to be in the to be accustomed to speak in that way, without attributing to him a conception.
In my mind is whether that obligation to preserve a fine instrument for future generations has got anything directly to do with the philosophical issue of meaning, communication, and so forth. I don't see that it does. I grant these obligations, and they seem to me important, but they're obligations to future generations or to aesthetic concerns, which are real ones, important ones, and so forth. And of course, it would be a shame to destroy distinctions that we have a use for. I was shocked to find a perfectly good dictionary allowing octopi as the plural octopus. I was astonished. I was writing a review of Quine's autobiography in which he invents what he thinks is the plural octopus, and I thought he had it wrong, and I would write about that, although there are three possibilities that were allowed by the 7 dictionaries I looked in. Not one of them was the one Quine had chosen, and the reason was that he had simply produced it by knowing some Greek, but it turned out that the word that he wanted for the plural octopus had already been used for something else. It's a typical kind of case of the sort that Michael is talking about. I don't think, incidentally, that anybody misunderstood Quine, and in fact, we might even say he didn't care what I was going to find in the dictionary at all. He wanted people to know that he knew the plural of octopus in Greek. I think really Michael's reply is basic for one person to do the same thing as another person does. The convenience of that, the fact that the way in which we learn languages, in fact, completely depends upon our more or less imitating others and so forth. I don't deny any of that. And the question what dictionaries ought to do, I have no strong opinions about that. I don't see why they can't do both things. I mean, they can say, here's a corruption that a lot of people go in for, so you can say that's what really is meant by this word. And at the same time they say, well, that's bad stuff. We can have a core of experts who were asked their opinion, which one of the Webster type dictionaries does very nicely. They find their experts divided 60 to 40 on this usage and so on. And I have an objection also to Webster's third, which doesn't say anything about how the language used to be used, how it would be nice still to use it, and so forth. The most vulgar usages are put that's just wrong and foolish. As I told its editor, but he didn't listen to me.
I don't want to take all the time, but perhaps the intention of the remarks I made about dictionaries to this, the relevance of it to this discussion has got blurred. We're not here to discuss how dictionaries should be written. The point is that the people who attack the makers of dictionaries for attempting to be prescriptive, or praise them for being purely descriptive, mean to say that it is a mistake in the conception of meaning or in the conception of a language to suppose that anyone has the right to lay down rules or say that there are rules. They think meaning is just what people attach to the words they utter. And that changes. Of course, they attach different meanings, and all you've got to do is record what meanings they attach. I say we only are able to understand people who misuse words, as we all do sometimes, of course, because we guess at the mistake they made. We have to have the conception of the meaning of the word in the language and the way different words are formed so as to be able to perceive what it is that someone, as you say, intended to say.
Used question. So I'm just trying to sort out these various issues. That seems to me to be it. There's obviously a very large a person that you understand, whether you want to say that they have to follow a rule or just to say they have to behave in the same way. The word rule has implications that I'm just not willing to buy without looking into it.
A number of people are trying. First I can do it, and then...
She immediately put the volume of the gramophone down. She didn't know any philosophy. She didn't know the word. She didn't run to muffle the rabbit in the vicinity or anything. She put the volume of the gramophone down. Now you say she must have guessed the meaning of the word in the language, but it might have been, it certainly was a word she'd never heard. It might have been a word that nobody had ever heard, right? I mean, it just made up. And so I'm not even sure that regularity is required. I mean, it just seems that there's a background of regularity perhaps, but that seems to not even bring in the notion of obligation or anything like that for any particular word. Not for loud, not for any word. So when you say she guessed at the meaning of the word, it doesn't require anything vis-a-vis that word.
But you took the word guide to mean in English gramophone. She might have done it. She took it that you were, for some eccentric reason, using this odd word to mean gramophone, because that was the salient thing that was loud. Right? If there had been 2 or 3 very loud things, of course she wouldn't have had the faintest idea. It is a matter of making an estimate of the praise from something that doesn't have a clear meaning, from an utterance that doesn't have a clear meaning, to what you will probably be driving at. Of course.
Yes, but that doesn't it undermine the idea that even a regularity is required for any particular word? It's not a deviation from anything. You see, that properly introduced into this discussion, which you thought was essential.
Well, I don't see the way of doing it and getting it used in some small circle is to make a joke of that kind. In circumstances when it's possible to guess what you intended. But I don't see that makes a strong point against saying, but I would like to say something about regularity and rule. See, suppose you drew up a big list. You didn't know anything about chess, but you watched people playing chess, and you drew up a big list of the moves that are never made. Now, of course, a lot of these would include, most of them would be illegal moves. Some would be very stupid moves to make, you know. People don't make them, but... And there are lots of things we don't say because it would be utterly stupid or irrelevant or idiotic to say. There are no rules against saying it. And some of them would be very clever moves that no one had thought of making.
As a real one, I was going to pronounce this one, that was a real one. There was a confusion between Lord Chesterfield and G.K. Chesterton, both of whom made remarks which are often quoted. In which case, you wouldn't have been talking about anybody at all. Well, at least all we can say is Jameson has made a confusion between Chesterton and Chesterfield. You know, I mean, now, similarly, or more generally, I mean, to go on to a more general thing, I wanted to think, and I thought this was implicit in what Michael said, and then wasn't answered by Donald, really. This formulation of what we want to do is to communicate. Our aim is to communicate, and that is to be taken to mean what one does mean. And of course, when one hears a person talk ungrammatically or in a confused or manner or in a dialect, especially with things written in a dialect, which it's perhaps impossible it's very difficult to translate. The question arises, well, what do they mean? Is there something that they really do mean? And usually there is, and that's why we have to say, well, it's just they're talking in dialect, or it's just that they're saying it in an ungrammatical way, as you've said. But isn't there a general requirement that there should be something that they do mean? And doesn't this thing that they do mean have to be expressible in a language where there is such a thing as literal meaning? It's only because they're able, because we're able, or because it is expressible in a language which is at least as good as English, that there is something that they mean. I mean, because in other words, you're using the concept of meaning to explain the concept of communication. And you're not entitled to do so unless you can give an account of meaning which doesn't depend on a language which has rules. Now,
how somebody speaks doesn't get everything that's involved, because there are ways of doing that where you describe regularities, but you wouldn't have given any meaning to the idea that they could go wrong, they could fail. Basically, to say what they mean would be one way of putting it. I would include things in the regularities that I think get at that, and I hinted at how I thought that could be done. I'm just objecting to the introduction of the word rule without justifying the difference between rule and law or generalization or something of that sort. I think the Chesterton example is a good one, because you can easily give a clear meaning to the fact that I didn't say what I meant. It reminds me of another example, however, where I think I'm going to say something that you would disagree with. There, I'm agreeing with you. I once gave an entire informal lecture to a seminar in which I mixed up the names of two philosophers. I just simply attributed a whole set of views to somebody using the wrong name. Nobody in the seminar mentioned this. I woke up in the middle of the next night, good heavens. And so the next week I said to my seminar, I'm sorry I made this mistake, and they all said, oh, we noticed that, or we knew who you were talking about. Now, how, and there are different theories about how names get to refer to what they do. But I think myself that the history of how a name got attached to somebody is
often a relevant consideration. It was in the Chesterfield example. On the other hand, if you just start using a name for somebody, whether he was christened that way or not, whether anybody ever used that name before, and you keep on doing it in a consistent way, let's say ignorantly or on purpose, it doesn't make much difference. After a while, it gets to be his name. And then it has that literal meaning. Now, how long do you have to do it? Well, one thing to consider, at least, is whether the circumstances are such that people get it right pretty soon, or even right away. In the case of my misusing the names of these philosophers, the distinction between who I was referring to and what the words I was using referring to, at a certain point becomes a confused question. I don't want to say, no, look, there's just a simple matter of whose name this is. Well, there's a sense in which we understand that perfectly well. I gave somebody a new name, unwittingly, and that's certainly not something I wanted to continue doing, and I haven't continued doing it for obvious reasons. On the other hand, to say I literally was referring to one person when I meant another seems to me just there's nothing important about the way language operates that's explained by saying that. That's my claim.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this explanation about provenance. Could I say a word further about the general point I was making, which perhaps is too general, one has been put too generally. I was saying, you see, I think that using the notion of communication, or satisfactory communication, as a basic idea was a mistake unless you already had the notion of a language where there was a precise meaning established by, in which there are also rules for correct usage. Now, it's ridiculous. I mean, obviously, we try to use, when using philosophy, we try to use language, we have to try and use it very correctly. And your discussion is your discussion is couched itself in a language where precise distinctions are very important. And you're describing a situation as if from heaven. You're describing what ordinary people, and you're saying, oh no, what happens in language is that people try and get something over to somebody else. And it's okay if they are taken to mean what they do mean. But this, fine, I don't mind that formulation. But I do mind if you mean by it, if both sides think everything's going fine. It isn't an I'm all right, you're all right situation. There has to be a real communication. And this real communication means that there is something which is, in principle, describable in a language where things have a precise meaning. We don't necessarily have to use that language, but we try to use it when we're doing philosophy, and we should be trying to use it when we're writing dictionaries. So you're using a language in which there are, you're using, as if you like, it's your meta-language, I'm told.
They have to be ones that are intelligible to my audience. Now, whether that doesn't seem to me to touch on my basic contention, which was, does that require that they be the same words that you use to communicate that, let's say, the same thoughts?
I don't know how long we can
In Frege, Philosophy of Language, Chapter 4, Michael Dummet explains, with great clarity and force, why it is essential to Frege's broad sense of property. I am very much in agreement with these remarks and think that they apply widely, not just to Frege, but to philosophy in general, as it is important for us, whether we're interested in defending Frege's views or not. So I take seriously the need indicated in these remarks. One important and of course very controversial part of the dependent ontology is Frege's belief in the existence of a range of objects, numbers, to which simple numerals and other types of numerical expression are to be understood, on his view, as making reference. This belief, I think, may be seen as grounded in two claims. First, that such expressions function in certain statements as singular terms, and second, that the statements in which they so function are, some of them anyway, true. The effect of viewing the matter in this way is to reduce the question of whether numbers are among the objects that there are to questions about the logical form of certain statements and about their truth values. And that, in my view, is a definite advantage in discussing this kind of problem. But it is clearly an advantage that we can secure only if satisfactory criteria of the kind that Michael envisages can be provided. Now, of course, he himself goes on to develop in quite some detail criteria of the general kind that are wanted, and prefacing his specific proposals with the observation that we must presuppose some knowledge of the language to which they're to be applied. We may, for example, assume a capacity to recognise sentences as well or ill formed. But just because kinds of expressions other than singular terms, including importantly words that serve for the expression of generality, such as everything and nothing, can stand, as I should put it, salva congruitate, that is, without destructive effect on the grammar of sentences that contain a sentence. Such expressions can stand in positions occupiable by ordinary proper names, and they appear in positions that are not occupiable by singular terms. Thus, in particular, a policeman, I think this is one of Michael's examples, noting that the rogue cases exploit the possibility of taking the word something to express higher level generality, Michael proposes, after some discussion, to amend the first two conditions so as to require that the displayed occurrences of this word, the word something, be understood as expressing first level generality, and of course, accordingly, has to add a supplementary test for discriminating. The application of it can be reckoned satisfactory. And I shall be giving fairly detailed consideration, first page of the handout. They cannot, without further supplementation, accomplish what we require. The reasons for this and the kind of supplementary test that is needed form the topic of the next few paragraphs or so. Right, that's the biconditional we want to hold for each choice of Peter. Is wise, if and only if not Plato is wise. Alpha smokes, if and only if not Plato smokes, and so on. These are all instances of the partially instantiated scheme around the board. Yeah. These all have to hold true. I think we might put it by saying that there is no object which is wise if and only if Plato isn't, smokes if and only if Plato doesn't, and so on. Thus, as we said, is wise in the same sentential context is to be reckoned a singular term or not. We want the answer that it isn't, of course. Well, just to remind you of the notation. Is not wise. Is wise. Any choice of complementary expression by choosing a substantival quantifier phrase as beta. The requisite biconditional will then fail, a difference in the truth conditions of its components being consequent upon scope texts such as is the predicate is wise in someone is wise. Indeed, perhaps it's even more obvious in that case. Restriction, which when our candidate team, our candidate out, by in effect running the test, running a formulation of the test initially to work to pick out quantifiers, and then having done that to try and make the test, adapt the test to pick out predicates. We need a little bit of preliminary work here before we discuss the objections I want to focus on. example is with technical examples of the rather cruder sort with which I began. It would suffice, I think, to rule for the logically equivalent to some sentence phi star in which neither t nor any expression synonymous equipped to deal with the subtler type of case exemplified by Wetzel's example, where the validity of the inference does depend on the presence, in both the premise and the conclusion, of occurrences of the restricted quantifier phrase, everyone who voted for Bush in '88. So we must proceed along somewhat different lines. There are, in essential, the premises being logically equivalent to, it's true of everyone who voted for Bush in '88 that Bush is friendly with Noriega, or that Bush is knowledgeable about arms sales for hostages, and similarly for the conclusion. So these merely technical counterexamples that I've been discussing can be dealt with by amending the third condition so as to require that all occurrences of the predicates A, psi, and B, psi in the premise and conclusion should be essential occurrences in the sense explained. It might need some further supplementation, further amendment, whatever. Now, on one point, I'm in complete agreement with Michael, and that is that in addition to formal tests of these kind, we ought to require something I've thought a bit, which is whether one could show somehow that in effect no quantifier can get through the first three inferential tests. You know, they're designed precisely to exclude the quantifiers. And had I had more time, I would have said something about that. I think you can very nearly construct an argument that shows that, but the argument has a little gap in it, and confidence is rash, as I shall be thereof shown very soon. Term, or that you have the concept of existential quantification, but that you know how to use the word something reasonably well, at least to the extent of being able to assess as valid or invalid fairly simple inferences involved. Sometimes and I think possibly other people have talked about these tests as syntactic or formal, being emphasized, albeit a little bit unhappily, by this use of the expression syntactic. There's still a lot more to say about this, I guess, but maybe that answers your immediate question.
My second question is related, it's very general, to language that didn't have quantification.
But I have to confess that until I understand some things you were saying on the bus the other day, better than I do, I don't think I know a compelling argument for it. I think it's very tempting to think that that's true. And Donald was endeavouring to convince me, or at least to convince me that I needed to convince him. Sorry, it's going to be the wrong conclusion. He wanted some convincing that you could make the distinction in such a case that there would be any, well, he will express better than I can what he was trying to say. So effectively against somebody who says, but look, there could be a language in which there are singular terms, but for which, well, actually I've just thought of one, but I'm not quite sure about whether I really have an answer to that just at the moment.
I wouldn't say much about the details. I'm naturally very happy if defects in my original proposals can be satisfactorily patched up in the way this has been proposed, or something like the way it's been proposed. It would stand for, if we're going to use the notion of reference, refer to objects of very different kinds. And I'm certainly in complete agreement with Bob that we need to pick out this category before we start arguing about the semantic interpretation, of whether we can apply the notions of reference and so on. But that view could, of course, be challenged. One could think it's not useful to have a category of singular terms so broad in the second dimension that I mentioned. If we narrow in the first direction, so confine ourselves to expressions that are logically simple, we then arrive at some notion, very general notion, much broader than people usually use, of proper name, but in a narrower sense than phrase. Now, there's a lot of discussion, there's immense amounts in the literature about proper names. People never say what sort of term to start with. They've got a lot of doctrines about what proper names are, how they function, and so on. They never tell you what's to count as the proper name. I mean, they use lots of examples of personal names, Aristotle, Gödel, and so on, and throw in a few place names, and that's about it. These criteria, if they work, and were intended by Frege to work in such a way as to include an enormous amount more. They will include, for example, I just take some expressions, the sun, communism, chess, lattice theory, Christmas, I think, sugar, I mean, they're taking mass terms. When I may say that Bob was, of course, entirely right that one ought to be talking about the function within a particular sentence. Mass terms are a very short example, because, I would say, mass terms don't allow a plural. They usually do, you can talk about sugars, but then you're talking about cans of sugar, so proper names in general don't allow a plural. When they do, they're not being used as proper names. Now, it's a question, is it useful to count all this large range of expressions as belonging to a single category, having a lot in common, before we start making distinctions within it? We'll write long articles about proper names without so much as addressing that question. It seems to me it's the primary question. Frege, at the end of his life, conscious of the failure of his attempt to make logical construction of arithmetic in a tiny fragment, was so agonizing about this, saying, well, surely 7 is a prime number, has the same logical form, I don't think, some expression like that, as Sirius is a fixed sum. If it's wrong to seek for such a large category, then you just break it completely off the track in making that remark. It was purely superficial resemblance that he was taking as a profound one. Well, I just mentioned that. I mean, I'm completely with you on this. I think that this is a fundamental category. First of all,
it's very good to say without thinking about it a lot more, but I think there is an issue about how much one ought to presuppose. One's presupposing in the relatively little that I think Michael explicitly presupposes, and I've gone along with him. One is presupposing a certain amount of logical competence on the part of, or competence with logical words, on the part of speakers of the language for which the tests are being devised. And I think it would be unfortunate if one presupposed what are independently controversial things, such as intuitionistically invalid inference schemes, and that may well necessitate some restriction on the rather sweeping.
Considered a sentence like, if some vase gets broken, there'll be a flaming row, or something like that. Right. And you dealt with that by saying, well, that's equivalent to if any vase is broken. It's just an idiom of English. It seems to me it's a little more than an idiom of English, and I'm just not certain. If you consider cases, sentences, where the existential phrase doesn't have wide scope, doesn't have the scope of the whole sentence, it may be you can construct other counter-examples which you couldn't deal with that way.
Comment on that. I make a historical, a recent historical comment on that as a sort of autobiographical one. In an earlier version of this material, I this kind of case. I mean, what we're essentially concerned with is a very familiar phenomenon of the equivalence between formulae, if I may speak of quantificational versions of them, formulae in which we have an existential quantifier occurring with narrow scope with respect to a sentential connective being equivalent to corresponding formulae with a universal quantifier dominant. Yeah. And there are many examples, obviously involving conjunction and disjunction as well as involving the conditional. And I originally thought that the best way to deal with, well, I originally thought that perhaps the only way to deal with this would be to go for a sort of two-stage application of the test, so that one initially restricted the application of the tests to, well now, one has to be careful here. One doesn't have the notion of an atomic sentence in the usual sense at one's disposal at this stage. Yeah. And then deal with the occurrences within opaque context in that way. It's probably, if I may, it's probably worth saying something about one of the reasons, though not the only reason, why I'm particularly interested in this enterprise. Yeah. Then, of course, it would be important to, for the purposes of raising the ontological questions about, say, arithmetic, that one assured oneself that one was dealing with contexts that were not abnormal.
There can be complications in applications. For instance, if you take the notion of essential occurrence, here there's large equivalent occurs here, so it will be undecidable, I suppose, whether something essentially occurs. Now, I could say that it doesn't matter because it's not a question of carrying out this in practice, but you want a theory about it. So these complications, kind of complications, perhaps not so terrible. But from a theoretical point of view, these complications are worrying because one could think that there should be, maybe a superstition to think that should be a simple answer to this question, but one could anyway be afraid that something goes wrong when it comes to complications. As, for instance, with this essential occurrence, for instance, wouldn't it be the case that if A that occurs, maybe in a part, A occurs essentially, you could say, but it occurs in a part which doesn't need it, so you could take away that and get a large equivalent from it.
I have a paragraph that I suppressed in which I discuss that very problem. I mean, I think I'm onto the right track. Female and T is a fox. We can show that neither of these predicates is essentially occurring in this sentence by noting the equivalence to T as a vixen. And I have a reformulation that is, I hope, designed, what is designed, I hope it does deal with that kind of worry, yes. Yeah, sure. About the, I mean, if your worry about complexity is, well, yes, there's a different kind of worry that I've sometimes heard about the complexity of the criteria. People say, well, it just can't be the case that people really go around deciding which expressions are singular terms by means of anything so complicated as this. Disputes between Platonists and nominalists don't occur as between people who are sort of busily applying any such complicated criteria. They think they can tell much more easily. Well, I'm not terribly moved so far by, maybe I should be, but I haven't yet seen anything to be really worried about in that more generalized worry about complexity. I mean, I'm perfectly prepared to grant that a lot of the time people operate with a much cruder and less reliable criteria.
Highly dubious, because of its implicative nature. So that's, or at least there is something to be, there remains something to be said about that issue when the second order quantification is at all understandable from a constructive point of view. And the third point I wanted to make concerns the relation between formal language and English. And that's also relevant with what we heard earlier this morning, because it seems to me that normally when we speak of, we will have English and then this would be formalized in this way. It seems that the relation, the crucial relation, goes the other way around. We have a formalism, and by means of what computer scientists call sugaring. this is something which you couldn't say in the formalization, but you would impose that on them and then see what happens.
Practice it in a piecemeal way. Dummet calls the most extreme examples of the latter type particularists, and his defense of his own position and Heidegger's includes a critique of the best case that has yet been made for pushing the opposite. But nevertheless, each of what I'm going to try to identify as Wittgenstein's theories does make a certain contribution to our understanding of the phenomenon of meaning. So, without supporting Dummet's strong claims, I shall be defending a scaled-down version of the idea behind it. Uncompromising particularism has never helped anyone to understand anything which produced the compromise were even stronger. I'm going to divide this paper into 5 parts. First, I'll say something about the connection between Wittgenstein's early doctrine of showing and his later naturalistic treatment of language. And this, for reasons that will soon become apparent, is a necessary introduction to what follows. Then in the second part, I shall analyze Wittgenstein's opposition to the sort of comprehensive theory of language which Dummet advocates. Third, I shall argue that there is another kind of theory implicit in his treatment of the first-person pronoun I. Fourth and fifth, I shall argue that the private language argument and his naturalistic account of rule following also rest on unacknowledged theories. And so, according to Wittgenstein, any attempt to state them as facts, even when P and Q are only mentioned, is bound to fail so long as the signs are functioning as symbols with their senses. Similarly, this was Wittgenstein's view of his own theory of language in Tractatus. We naturally want to know how all these things are going to be shown. And his view was that they would be shown by the actual practice of speaking the language. And the consequences of that answer are drawn out later in the long examination of rule following in philosophical investigations. But the point I'm making, which is seldom made, is that this idea is already implicit in the Tractatus. And the expansion and explanation of the idea begins in the lectures that Wittgenstein gave in Cambridge in 1930, this paper. The point I want to make now is a general one. Wittgenstein's later philosophy was the outcome of 2 major changes, not one. First, everyone must agree with Dummet, at least to this extent, that Wittgenstein moves to a point much closer to particularism than Michael Dummet's own position is. Understating it. First, and fundamentally, it seemed to him that they were not really theories. Second, whatever their status, he thought that they achieved their scope only by ignoring the requirements that they had to fit the facts. The first of these 2 objections is based on the doctrine of showing, and is developed most perspicuously in the Blue Book. Suppose that a philosopher faces the question. The theory, according to Wittgenstein's view of the theory, will explain a phenomenon which was previously baffling, and it will explain it by connecting it with something else, for which, of course, there must be an independent criterion of identity. And that at least least is how the simplest accounts are true, but their mistake is the inevitable consequence of the destruction of any systematic philosophical theory, which is how Wittgenstein takes it. Wittgenstein's second objection to completely general theories is that such theories achieve their scope only by ignoring the requirement that they have to fit the facts. This, as I've already suggested, is not an objection based on the doctrine of showing, or based on the semantic status of philosophical discourse. It's based on the structure of the subject matter. And this point is made very forcefully in the well-known section of Investigations 304, which I'll read out. The paradox, that is, the paradox generated by the assumption that pain is an object, disappears only if we make a radical break with the idea that language always functions in one way, always serves the same purpose, to convey thoughts, which may be about houses, pains, good and evil, or anything else you please. Now, Michael Dummet calls this an expression of a total rejection of Frege's approach to language, and that it is, but only in the sense that it reduces the scope of a Fregean treatment of declarative sentences. Between pain and the word is only minimally an intellectual achievement, and the use of the word is more like an automatic reaction than like the expression of a thought. Now, this kind of example does provide Wittgenstein with a strong case for restricting the scope of the general theory of declarative sentences that they always serve to express thoughts. His claim is that the theory simply does not fit the cases where the forging of the link between words and things is not an intellectual achievement, or at most only minimally an intellectual achievement. But of course, the next question must be how extensive is this class of cases and how are they specified? His presentation of a single counterexample to the rejected theory is evidently, at least I suppose, not a piece of extreme particularism. It must be possible to put the exception under some general description of the scope of this objection action. Sometimes they point in a different direction. They point very clearly at connections between language and its subject matter. After all, it must be important that we engage in language games against the background of supportive facts. And this abstinence is odd. After all, there's a real continuity here between the reason for the existence of the rules and the claim made by someone used by nature, leaving the other possibilities to be excluded by someone who uses the sentence to make a claim. If no stateable sense conditions are left, they've all been absorbed as truth conditions in that area, and the only remaining sense condition is that certain simple objects exist, and that, according to the theory of Tractatus, is not something that can be stated. It is, of course, more realistic to apply the distinction between sense conditions and truth conditions at the level of unanalyzed sentences, where sense conditions can be stated. But we might ask what really would be wrong with treating this kind of explanation as part of philosophy of language. Well, I'll read you Wittgenstein's answer to that question. Investigations. He says, if formation of concepts can be explained by facts of nature, should we not be interested not in grammar, but rather in that in nature, which is the basis of the grammar? I'm just interested in both. Expression of theory is more involuntary, or at least more automatic than a description of one's feelings about the prospect, or disclosure that based on reflection on one's state of mind. Rather, as Wittgenstein takes gradations, this distinction is not sharp. However, it does provide him with a way of specifying cases in which it would be a distortion to maintain that language is used to convey thoughts. And this is very straightforward, and I'm going to say more. The other way of classifying this kind in this situation, there would be nothing to show a learner that he was applying a sensation word correctly, because all that he would have would be his own impression of correct application, which in a learner carries no weight. And how could he ever get out of the position of being a learner? Indeed, it wouldn't even be clear what would count as correct application in a detached phenomenal world, and that is It is therefore all the more important to discover the exact specification of the class to which the counterexample is now being taken to belong. For we need to be able to identify the points at which this infinite regress of checks generated by the intellectualist theory about the foundations of language can be seen to be decisively faulted. But, and this is very characteristic of him, although Wittgenstein's later writings are permeated by the idea that language is supported by a network of pre-linguistic connections, the points at which this support is most direct, and therefore most easily seen, are never specified. In fact, the range of cases which might plausibly be included in this class is impressive, and it's certainly not confined to a small group of sensations which we all find natural after we mastered the use of the word. This implies that the way in which we find it natural to continue will always run ahead of the lesson. That is, the teacher will reinforce our performances if he agrees with our performances until eventually he allows that we've graduated in the use of the word. And after that, the lesson will receive further reinforcement directly with the basic needs of our bodies. And in the other case, it seems that language has to be founded on internal connections which serve the needs of our bodies and have therefore been established by nature. I mean, flight from pain, and among social animals, a natural expression of pain, which is of course acquired by health. It seems to me that in both cases, a more open exploitation of the relevant science anthropology.
I mean, he reacts by spitting it out, for example. That is his natural way of reacting to that taste of that wine. An expert may naturally react by, for example, humming a certain tune from Debussy or something like that. And I mean, that is very important. I mean, this may come so natural to them, and he may find it
the case that there were certain natural associations between the type of sensation and this reaction. Those things are true, but they don't really bring that kind of case very close to the basic, to the case where there's a basic and shared natural expression with a social purpose instead, coming to pain. And that's going to be a case which is still going to be far removed even from your sophisticated drinkers, I think. But perhaps that's exaggerating the contrast. But I mean, if you look at the other examples, I mean, the discussion is there of whether you argue intellectually by analogy to somebody's pain, or
in such a way that the paradigmatic case would be unlearned things. I mean, things really natural in the sense of being merely innate or given us by Mother Nature. And I wanted to say that, I mean, Wittgenstein very often makes use of words like natural, instinctive, and so on, for things that are not only that, but are extremely complex, sophisticated, and so on. So I wanted really to get away from what trying to achieve a compromise, want to treat it as a paradigmatic case, whereas I want to treat those things, pain, etc., and pain as their expression, in such a way that
as you characterize the purely intellectual achievement from a concept of self-kind, or recognition of capacity description. I think the notion of purely intellectual achievement, that contrasted notion is under-described in this point.
Sorry, the notion of I think that's a good question. Came out
by the contrasted notion of purely intellectual achievement, to contrast precisely with the case, there was already a natural connection between the reactional behavioral expression and maintaining a certain kind of state of affairs. But it seems to me that it wants to do serious work in connection with private language with this notion. One both needs more description of the purely intellectual case. Are there such cases? What would be a prototype? And also some indication of why it follows from that contrast, as a natural case and the purely intellectual case, that the end product is different. That the kind of conceptual capacity embodied in the repertoire that goes on to require subscription of pain or whatever is different.
It's where the
achievement of learning, meaning the word vocabulary is purely intellectual. I don't give any explanation, discussion of that. Well, I think that my idea really was very simple, that if there wasn't any behaviour already linked in discriminating ways to the material, types of sensation in a certain range, if there was no behaviour already linked to those different types of sensation, and then learning how to apply words to them would be an intellectual achievement. And actually, that would be the case with most people who just enjoy wine, and because there's a great range of different tastes which people have to learn to discriminate if they're going to make a business of buying stuff. And that is, I was simply relying on a very simple dichotomy there. Your second point was that one ought to then ask whether this difference in the original situation of learning somehow remains as produced any effect on what one would say about a person understanding these words later when he has learned them.
I feel I understand Wittgenstein's particularism very much better after listening to you than I did. And I wanted to make a remark about the very important paragraph that you quoted, 3 or 4, if I remember right. You quoted at the beginning. It's about attacking the assumption that language always serves one purpose to express thoughts, which can be about AIDS, houses, good or evil, or whatever you like.
It may well appear persuasive until one notices that it is exactly parallel to the standard argument for fatalism, that is a view according to which it is pointless to do anything in order to affect the future. Here, Dummet cites the example of people who during the bombing of London would bother to run to the area shelter to avoid being killed by a bomb. Such a person might argue as follows. Either you are going to be killed by a bomb, or you are not going to be. If you are, then any precautions you take will be ineffective. If you are not, all precautions you take are superfluous. Therefore, it is pointless to take precautions. As most of us will be convinced that it is precisely our taking precautions which may serve to save our lives in such a situation, we shouldn't want to accept the fatalist's argument. But it is exactly parallel to the aforementioned argument against the possibility of affecting the past. The only difference is that the one is about the future and the other about the past. Here one might of course wish to insist that this difference is by no means negligible. After all, your son has either already been drowned or else already been saved, whereas you haven't yet been killed by a bomb, and you haven't yet come through it. I, for my part, must confess that I feel tempted to say exactly this and leave it at that. But Dummet thinks that to reply thus is merely to repeat that the one argument is about the past and the other about the future, which they are not. The people of this tribe believe that if their chief dances throughout the absence of the young men, his dancing will contribute to their having been brave. Of course, we immediately wonder about his having to dance during the whole period, including the time when the young men are on their way home. For the lion hunt is supposed to last 2 days, while 2 days are needed to reach the hunting grounds, and another 2 days to get back home. So, if there is a logical absurdity in trying to affect the past, then it should be possible for us to persuade the chief of that tribe that his dancing during the last 2 days of the young men's absence is utterly pointless, even if his other causal beliefs remain intact. Makes all the difference. For in that case, Dummet thinks, his ideas will begin to look too alien for us to be able to draw any moral for our own case. So if he accepts our suggestion that his state of ignorance or knowledge about the young man's behavior can't have anything to do with the efficacy of his dancing, he may be willing to accept the following challenge. which our voluntary actions would lead up to the non-occurrence of these events. On the other hand, as regards past events, we are sure that at least in principle, we shall always be able to find out about their non-occurrence in a way which doesn't involve any recourse to our intentions. Relying on the observer's reports, we identify a certain occasion as one on which the young men haven't been brave, the chief's dancing notwithstanding. Now we challenge him to go on dancing. There seem to be exactly two possibilities. If he goes on dancing, then this shows that his dancing isn't a sufficient condition for the lion hunters having been brave, a voluntary action. But, as Dummet points out, the situation isn't as simple as that. First, for the chief to count as behaving reasonably in continuing to dance after the first 4 days, he needn't assume that his dancing is a sufficient condition of bravery. All he needs is a significant positive correlation. What if the observers have for some reason or other given a false report when they said that the lion hunters had behaved cowardly? If this turns out to be the case on a fair number of occasions, then these occurrence or non-occurrence, independently of my intention to perform or not to perform action A. The difference between past and future lies in this, that we regard the third belief as holding true generally, while there are, as has been mentioned already, a great number of occasions on which we don't think we know anything about a future event's occurrence or non-occurrence independently of our intention to perform a certain action. So if we want to hold on to belief number 3, according to which there is no particular conceptual difficulty about the conception of such a backward causation. I, for my part, find it uncommonly difficult to imagine having such a concept, but that is not my point here. What I really can't understand is not only a logical order, but a temporal one. Even if such a being couldn't communicate with other beings, he would at least communicate with himself. And communicating with oneself involves using concepts in a certain order with a certain intention for a certain purpose. Inconsistent statement. Naturally, I have no complaint of that order to make about Dummet's example. Another kind of possible difficulty concerns the story you tell in presenting your example. This story should be plausible in the sense of offering a coherent narrative, independently of what it is meant to illustrate or elucidate. If it fails to be plausible in this fairly external respect, it's liable to confuse and mislead the reader or hearer of your story. The rationale of his dancing was simply this. Experience shows that there is a positive correlation between the dancing and the young men's bravery. Hence, the fact that the dances are being performed makes it more probable that the young men have been brave. But the dancing is something that is in my power to do if I choose. The fact remains that he doesn't talk like any chief you could imagine. He talks like Carl Gustav Hempel, or like Michael Dummet himself. It's connected with this, but concerns the argument more directly. Dummet asks us to conceive of the chief's dancing not as a religious ritual of any kind. Now, apart from the fact that it will often be difficult and sometimes impossible to achieve, it happens, not too frequently, but on and on, that in spite of all this dancing, the lion hunters behave cowardly. It is only because of this fact that we, the explorers, can challenge you to dance after the bad news has arrived, which is, after all, the presupposition of the subsequent argument, which leads to the identification of what was, whether the example he discusses will go very far in helping us to understand why this may be so.
The rule, which I'm attempting to follow, which is not to make the first comment.
Michael, do you promise?
Well, perhaps that. All right, let me say one thing. I think we can construct an example to bring out the point I was trying to make. The point I was trying to make was that without agency, then it's merely the way the world goes that determines which temporal direction the notion, appropriate notion of causality is associated more. The celestial one has a different set of causal laws. And of that, we are, well, almost, anyway, until very recently, we were mere observers in the sense that we had no practical ability to intervene. We couldn't reach it, we couldn't do anything to it. So now you just imagine observations made of the heavens.
And simply saying the arrow of time may point in the other direction, do you think they could really have a coherent picture which is really in accordance with the concepts they know how to use? I don't think they would very, very soon run up against unsurmountable difficulties of applying any of the other notions that ordinarily apply in order to describe that inaccessible region.
And it's very evident that for the ordinary causal interactions that govern the world as make, I just do think so, but of course I can't prove it without constructing an accurate example.
Yes. I mean, to the same point, but would you agree to the, further reaching point I made in that context, that the notion of a mere observer, in that stronger sense which I explained, having, that such a
draw our conference to an end. And in doing so, I think the one thing we'd all need to do is actually to thank Michael for coming and discussing his philosophy with us. I think we've found it very, at least I speak for myself, but I have heard others speak in a similar way. We found it very useful to be able to talk about this body of thought in which there is a considerable, I may say so, degree of unity, while at the same time there's a widespread philosophical interest in it. And we've, I think, found it very helpful. And I hope we'll perhaps, I hope we'll be able to print something. Per l'accoglienza che è stata molto gentile e che abbiamo molto apprezzato.
Brevemente, non perché, ma semplicemente perché è stato un protagonista, vorrei ringraziare particolarmente il professor Dummet per la sua amabilità, per la sua cortesia. Veramente siamo stati, anche se sono stati così pochi attimi di avvicinamento, abbiamo proprio conosciuto l'uomo e siamo rimasti veramente entusiasti. E allora noi, proprio a chiusura, vogliamo e desideriamo che voi portate un ricordo per la nostra istituzione. Abbiamo pensato di fare l'omaggio di un libro che la nostra amministrazione ha fatto proprio stampare. Si tratta di una serie di fotografie del nostro castello, della nostra abitare, così che porterete dietro assieme a un ricordo tangibile praticamente dei due che avete mostrato. Nonché una piccola medaglia riproducendo proprio il nostro castello e la data del convegno, nella speranza di farvi questa vita. Chiedo di ricordarci di come si fa la vita degli anni e semplicemente un augurio di ben arrivederci e ben ritrovarci. Speriamo che la cultura sia ancora più accogliente, comoda. Questo è il nostro. santo, professor santo. Professor Favata, nomi tutti difficili, dovete scusare, per le lingue noi conosciamo la scuola di lingue purtroppo. Professor Pinkodani. Grazie per il contributo notevole che ci ha dato. Professore speriamo che bastino per tutti. Professore Giulio. E per ultimo, perché desidero che lo accogliamo tutti con un bel applauso, il professor Dummet. Abbiamo finito, allora fuori che c'è il piccolo rinfresco, poi nel frattempo ok, va bene, okay, on the three, I want everybody, at count to three, everybody look at the picture. 1, 2, 3.
L'ombra, signori.
I'll give you my college address. This is much easier. Very easy. Because even if it moves, it's easy to know. Yes, I will. I can write much more easily than I can speak. But there may be some mistakes. I don't think the mistakes.
Ok, le caccia la vece, non viene già fatta.